A black businessman quietly boards first class, only to be met with open disrespect from a white flight attendant. Before anyone realizes who he truly is, she mocks him, belittles him, and even questions if he belongs in the seat. The businessman responds with calm dignity, ending the moment on a cliffhanger that hints at his true power. "We don't let people like you sit up here." The words dropped into the hush of the first-class cabin like a shard of glass. Passengers looked up, from newspapers and glowing laptop screens, their brows knitting in confusion. The statement didn't belong in this polished space of champagne flutes and silk neck pillows, but there it was, sharp and ugly, hanging in the air. The flight attendant, a woman in her mid-30s with a fixed smile trained by years of customer service, stood blocking the aisle. Her posture carried more than protocol. It carried arrogance, the subtle lean of someone convinced of superiority. The way her eyes narrowed told everyone she wasn't simply enforcing rules. She was drawing a line, a border, right there in the cabin. The black man standing in front of her didn't flinch. His charcoal gray suit absorbed the cabin light, crisp as if it had just been pressed. A slim leather briefcase dangled effortlessly at his side, its brass clasps gleaming faintly. He was calm, too calm for someone just told he didn't belong. His silence stretched, filling the space the attendant thought she controlled. Around them, passengers shifted uncomfortably. A businessman in row 2 lowered his glasses. A couple across the aisle paused mid-sip of white wine. No one spoke, but their eyes darted between the uniformed woman and the man she had tried to reduce with one line. The attendant's smile sharpened. "Sir, economy is toward the back. Perhaps you took a wrong turn." She gestured down the narrow corridor, as though sweeping away something inconvenient. The man inhaled slowly, his gaze sweeping across the pristine rows of wide leather seats, the sparkling glasses on polished trays, the muted hum of wealth. His silence wasn't weakness, it was calculation. He slid his boarding pass from the pocket of his jacket with deliberate care, like a magician revealing a card. Without a word he extended it. She snatched it, her eyes flicking across the printed words. Seat 1A, first class, paid in full. A legitimate ticket that should have ended the conversation. But instead she laughed, a small, sharp sound. "Strange," she muttered just loudly enough for nearby passengers to hear. "I didn't realize they sold seats like this to—" Well, her voice trailed off, but the venom lingered. A man in row 3 frowned, glancing at his phone as if unsure whether to intervene. The silence in the cabin grew heavier, pressing against everyone's ribs. The black man's expression never shifted. Instead, he placed his briefcase carefully into the overhead compartment, the click of the latch crisp, final. He lowered himself into seat 1A, smoothing the cuff of his sleeve. Every movement was unhurried, deliberate, dignified. When he finally spoke, his voice was soft but carried an undeniable weight. "Funny thing about altitude," he said, eyes fixed on the attendant. "It reveals who's truly above and who's still crawling on the ground." Gasps rippled faintly across the cabin. The attendant stiffened, her cheeks blooming red. Her hand clenched around the boarding pass, crumpling the edges. She opened her mouth to snap back, but something in his steady gaze froze her. He leaned back into the leather seat, crossing one leg over the other, the faintest smile tugging at his lips. His calm radiated like armor. His words had flipped the air, and everyone felt it. And then, just as she reached for the safety of another insult, his phone buzzed. He slid it from his pocket, pressed it to his ear. "Yes, the board meeting can wait," he said lightly, eyes still on her. "I've just boarded. I'll be speaking with the CEO of the airline soon enough." The cabin went utterly still. Flight attendant's face drained of color. He ended the call, slipped the phone back into his jacket and looked at her again with a steady calm. "Shall I buckle up?" he asked softly. "Or would you like to explain to your employer why you tried to throw out one of their biggest investors?" The woman froze, her breath catching audibly. The other passengers stared at her now, not at him. The balance had shifted, and she knew it. The black businessman leaned back, resting his head against the seat. His eyes closed as if nothing more needed to be said. Yet the cliffhanger lingered, pulsing in the charged silence of the cabin. Who exactly was this man? This quiet figure she had mocked. The silence in the cabin didn't dissolve, it thickened. The air was no longer filled with the hum of engines and the rustle of expensive magazines. Instead, it pulsed with something heavier, tension. Passengers leaned subtly toward one another, whispering behind hands, curiosity tugging at their composure. "Did you hear that?" murmured the man in row 2, lowering his newspaper. "Board meeting with the airline CEO." His seatmate adjusted her pearl necklace, eyes wide. "He must be someone important." The attendant heard them, of course. She heard every word, and it stung. She forced her posture straighter, smoothing down the edges of her uniform skirt. Her practiced smile returned, but cracks were beginning to show. Her voice carried a false brightness as she addressed the other passengers. "Ladies and gentlemen, we'll be departing shortly. Please make yourselves comfortable." But no one was looking at her anymore. Their eyes flicked instead to the man, Fin-Swanee, who sat like a stone statue carved with dignity. His presence absorbed attention. He wasn't loud. He didn't demand. But every passenger felt pulled into his orbit. He reached slowly into his briefcase and pulled out a slim leather notebook, flipping it open with care. The motion was ordinary, yet the way he did it suggested authority, as though every line of ink inside those pages carried weight beyond measure. The attendant cleared her throat. "Sir, would you like a drink before takeoff?" Her tone strained for control, but even as she spoke, a faint tremor betrayed her. He didn't look up. "Water will do." 2 words. Simple. But passengers felt the coolness in his voice, the deliberate absence of respect for hers. She had tried to belittle him, and he would not grant her the courtesy of acknowledgement beyond necessity. Whispers spread further down the cabin. "Investor, maybe?" He said, "Board meeting." He must be loaded if he's in 1A. The businessman scribbled a note in his book, pausing to glance at the cabin lights as though checking something only he understood. His watch glinted beneath his cuff, gold but understated, the kind of piece that suggested old money, not showy wealth. The attendant set the water on his tray, her hand careful not to shake. He accepted it without a word, his silence striking, harder than any insult could. Somewhere near row 4, a passenger pulled out his phone, pretending to check email, but angling the screen to search the news. "Black businessman airline board," he typed. The search returned results almost instantly. His eyes widened. He nudged his companion. Look at this." A blurred image of the man appeared in an article header. The headline, "Marcus Hale Majority Stakeholder Eyes Expansion in Airline Industry." The name trickled down the row like a secret, passed among children in church. Marcus Hale. The whispers grew louder, but carefully muted. No one wanted to appear rude, yet curiosity burned too brightly to contain. The attendant caught the name too, her pulse quickening. She pasted on her professional smile once again, bending slightly toward him. "Mr. Hale, I trust you'll find the flight comfortable." For the first time, he looked up from his notebook, his gaze locked on hers, steady, unreadable. The briefest silence hung between them, passengers holding their breath for his reply. Then calmly he said, "Comfort isn't given, Miss—" He glanced at her name tag, his pause deliberate. Stevens. It's created. And so far, the atmosphere. Hair is thin. Her throat tightened. A faint blush spread across her cheeks as she stepped back quickly, hands clutched behind her. Marcus closed his notebook and leaned back, resting his chin on his hand. His eyes swept the cabin once more, lingering on the curious passengers before. Settling on the window, watching the ground crew outside load luggage into the belly of the aircraft. Inside, silence had returned. But this silence was different. It was no longer awkward, it was reverent. The balance of power had shifted. He wasn't simply another man in first class, he was someone above it. And as the engines roared to life, rattling glasses in their holders, the whispers had already transformed into something else. Respect. Still, Marcus didn't smile. He didn't gloat. His face remained calm, unreadable, as if he had weathered such storms before and knew that the turbulence was never outside the aircraft. It was always inside the people who underestimated him. When the seatbelt light dinged, and the plane began its slow roll down the runway, Miss Stevens returned to her jump seat, her mind racing. She couldn't shake his words. Thin atmosphere created comfort. Who was this man, really? And how had she just managed to insult him in front of an entire cabin of witnesses? Her nails dug faintly into the leather armrest. For the first time in her career, she wasn't sure if she'd land with her job still intact. And Marcus Hale, gazing out the window as the city lights blurred into streaks below, allowed himself one small thought, quiet but razor-sharp. They always reveal themselves at altitude. The plane lifted smoothly into the sky, engines humming like a giant beast pushing against gravity. The cabin tilted back as city lights slipped away, shrinking into a sea of glitter below. But inside first class, the tension hadn't leveled. Out, it was climbing higher with the altitude. Marcus Hale sat in 1A with his seat reclined slightly, hands resting on the armrest, calm as stone. He hadn't spoken since takeoff, but silence didn't make him invisible. It made him monumental. Every eye flicked to him, some openly, some in stolen glances over tablet screens. Across the aisle, a woman in a navy pantsuit leaned toward her. "Husband." "That's Marcus Hale," she whispered. "I read about him in Forbes last year. He owns parts of 3 airlines already." Her husband nodded, eyebrows raised. "And she," he tilted his chin toward Ms. Stevens, "just tried to throw him out of first class." The whispers carried, even if passengers thought they were discreet. Ms. Stevens heard every word, and her pulse thumped against her uniform. Collar. She busied herself with seatbelt checks, drink carts, anything to avoid Marcus's gaze. But the more she tried to act normal, the more her movements trembled with stiffness. She stopped at row 2, offering a forced smile. "Another glass of wine for you, sir." The man hesitated. His eyes flicked toward Marcus before he answered, "No, thank you. I'll wait." She moved on quickly, her cheeks hot. Her authority, normally unquestioned in this cabin, was slipping through her fingers like sand. Marcus, meanwhile, finally reached for his glass of water. He lifted it slowly, his reflection rippling in the clear liquid. The glass caught the overhead lights, gleaming like a symbol of quiet endurance. When he sipped, he didn't just drink. He commanded. Even the smallest gesture radiated control. The high. Businessman in row 3 leaned forward. "Mr. Hale, if I may—" His voice trembled slightly, unsure if he should even speak. Marcus turned his head, acknowledging him with a calm nod. I read your article on sustainable aviation. Truly visionary. The industry needs leadership like yours." Marcus inclined, his head. "Thank you." 2 words again, measured, unhurried, yet carrying the weight of recognition. The man leaned back, satisfied, as though he'd just received a rare blessing. Ms. Stevens's throat tightened. Every compliment to Marcus was a blade against her. She had mocked him publicly, and now seat by seat the passengers were siding with him. Her smile stretched thinner, cracking at the edges. She returned to the galley, gripping the edge of the counter until her knuckles whitened. Her mind replayed her words. "We don't let people like you sit up here." The sentence haunted her now, echoing over the hum of the engines. A sharp ding interrupted her thoughts. The call button. Row 1A. Her heart stuttered. For a brief second, she considered ignoring it. But she couldn't. Not now. She smoothed her hair, adjusted her uniform, and forced herself to step back into the cabin. Every passenger's eyes tracked her as she approached Marcus's seat. "Yes, Mr. Hale?" His gaze lifted slowly, steady as stone. "This table is unsteady," he said quietly, tapping the edge of his tray. It was such a small thing, a simple request. But the way he said it, measured, calm, unbothered, turned it into something else entirely. It was a reminder that even the smallest flaw was her responsibility. She bent quickly, fumbling with the latch until the tray locked firmly in place. As she straightened, he met her eyes with calm intensity. "Comfort," he said softly, "is in the details." Her chest tightened. She nodded too quickly, retreating back down the aisle. Behind her, whispers bloomed again. "Did you hear that? He's teaching her a lesson without even raising his voice. Dignity. That's real power." Marcus set his water down, leaning back again. He hadn't raised his tone, hadn't demanded, hadn't humiliated her publicly. But the message had landed harder than any confrontation could have. The cabin knew who held power now, and Miss Stevens, standing stiff in the galley, knew it too. She clutched the service cloth in her hands, her pulse thundering in her ears. The altitude wasn't just exposing her error, it was magnifying it, turning every glance, every whisper, every respectful nod toward Marcus into a spotlight on her. Failure. When the captain's voice crackled through the speakers, announcing smooth cruising altitude, the words felt ironic to her. For everyone else, the flight was steady. But for her, this was free fall. The hum of the engines smoothed into a steady drone, but inside Miss Stevens there was no calm. Her uniform. Collar felt too tight, the neat bun at the back of her head too rigid, as if the very clothes she wore were pressing against her like a cage. She tried to breathe, tried to focus on routine. Routine will save you, she told herself. Coffee, tea, meals. If she stuck to service, she could bury what had happened. But every step she took down the aisle reminded her of the eyes, watching, judging, whispering. At row 3, a woman raised her glass. "Could I trouble you for champagne?" Miss Stevens nodded quickly, but when she turned to fetch it, she caught sight of Marcus. Still in seat 1A, still silent, still radiating composure. His posture was regal, legs crossed, one hand resting against his chin as if deep in thought. He hadn't spoken since the tray table, but his silence thundered louder than any reprimand. She poured the champagne too quickly. Bubbles fizzed over the rim, spilling onto her fingers. "Careful," the passenger muttered. Her cheeks flushed, crimson as she cleaned the mess. She could feel Marcus's eyes on her, though he hadn't even moved. When she returned to the galley, she pressed her palms to the cold metal counter, shutting her eyes. "You've been doing this for 12 years. 12, you've never slipped like this, but she had. And everyone had seen it." Meanwhile, the passengers leaned closer to Marcus, testing the boundaries of his silence. "Mr. Hale," said the man in the second row, a finance executive by the look of his tie clip. "I must say, your reputation precedes you. The work you've done in modernizing airlines, remarkable." Marcus inclined his head slightly. "Work is only as valuable as the people it serves." Simple words, but they landed like a sermon. Even the woman beside the executive leaned in, nodding as though she'd just heard wisdom worth carrying home. Another passenger chimed in from behind. "Is it true you've been pushing for more eco-friendly aviation?" Marcus's lips curved, slightly, the faintest suggestion of a smile. "Change is a long runway, but eventually every plane has to take off." The passengers chuckled softly, admiration thick in their tones. It wasn't just what he said, it was how he said it. Calm, steady, with the cadence of someone who had nothing to prove, and every word, every respectful glance, was another crack in Ms. Stevens's armor. She returned with the next round of service, but this time when she leaned toward Marcus, her hands betrayed her. The silver tray shook faintly, glasses trembling against each other. Marcus reached out, not to take the drink, but to steady the tray with 2 fingers. His touch was light, but his gaze was firm. "Steady hands," he murmured softly, meeting her eyes. The words weren't cruel, they weren't loud, but in the silence of first class, they might as well have been a gavel striking wood. Her throat constricted. She nodded sharply, retreating down the aisle as fast as her dignity allowed. Passengers exchanged looks. A few even smiled, not at her but at Marcus. They saw it now, plain as day. He wasn't just a passenger. He was in control without ever leaving his seat. In the galley, Miss Stevens gripped the tray until her fingers ached. She wanted to scream, wanted to justify herself, but she couldn't. Every gesture, every word of his was deliberate and clean. He was dismantling her without malice, without even trying, and the cabin knew it. One passenger whispered, "She tried to humiliate him, and now look, she's the one unraveling." Another replied, "Power doesn't need volume. He's proving." That. The voices carried, each one hammering against her pride. Marcus, meanwhile, returned to his notebook, writing as though none of it concerned him. But every so often, his gaze flicked toward her reflection in the galley mirror. He could see her breathing shallow, her shoulders tight. He didn't need to raise his voice. Her collapse was already happening on its own. Then came the symbolic crack. As she leaned to adjust a passenger's blanket, her name tag slipped loose from its pin, clattering to the floor. The metallic sound echoed louder than it should have. She froze. Every passenger's eyes turned. Marcus didn't move, didn't smile, didn't gloat. He simply lowered his gaze to the floor where the name tag lay, then back to her face. The silence was unbearable. With trembling fingers she picked it up, reattaching it to her uniform. But the damage was done. In a single symbolic gesture her authority had fallen, and the cabin saw it. As she turned away, her cheeks burning, Marcus's voice drifted softly, meant for her ears but carried far enough for the first few rows to, "Here names carry weight, best not to drop them." The words landed like stone, not loud, not cruel, but final. The passengers sat in quiet awe, their eyes fixed on him. And Ms. Stevens? She felt her carefully built world begin to crumble. The seatbelt sign dinged back on, a chime that cut through the hum of quiet conversation. A patch of turbulence rolled beneath the plane, sending a ripple of vibration through the cabin. Champagne glasses trembled, silverware rattled faintly against china. But inside Miss Stevens, the turbulence was worse. Her heartbeat stuttered and climbed, her thoughts shaking harder than the plane. She tightened her grip on the galley counter, whispering to herself, "Breathe, just breathe." Passengers chuckled lightly as the aircraft bobbed. A man in row 2 made a joke about roller coasters, drawing laughter. But the humor didn't touch her. It felt far away, muffled by the roar inside her chest. Marcus, however, sat unmoved. His seatbelt clicked into place with measured precision, and his body barely shifted with the bumps. Where others bounced slightly, He seemed to anchor himself with sheer presence. A passenger across from him noticed. "Unshaken, Mr. Hale," the woman said with a nervous smile, gripping her armrest tightly. He turned his gaze toward her, calm and steady. "Storms pass. It's how you carry yourself through them that people remember." Her shoulders eased. The words, spoken like smooth stone, steadied her more than the belt across her waist. She exhaled, smiling faintly. The man beside her leaned in. "That's perspective you don't get every day." Marcus nodded, turning his attention back to the window where lightning flickered faintly in distant clouds. Meanwhile, Ms. Stevens braced herself against the galley wall. She wanted to speak, to reassert authority. But every time she pictured herself walking down the aisle, she remembered the name tag hitting the floor, the whispers, the way Marcus had looked at her with quiet authority. She tried to convince herself. He's just a passenger, just a man in a suit, nothing more. But the passengers didn't see him that way, not anymore. Row by row, admiration spread like wildfire. Did you hear what he said? Storms pass. Brilliant. He's got presence. Real leadership. The turbulence eased, the cabin settling back into steady flight. But the storm inside Ms. Stevens didn't calm. It grew, rattling her more than the engines had. She forced herself back down the aisle, carrying a tray of waters. Her hands shook, though she tried to hide it. When she reached Marcus's row, she placed a glass on his table. This time it was steady. No tremor, no slip. She almost exhaled in relief. But Marcus didn't move to take it. Instead, he studied her silently. The pause stretched long enough that passengers leaned forward, curious. Finally, he reached for the glass, his fingers brushing it lightly before lifting it. He raised it, not to his lips, but slightly in her direction. "To steadier hands," he said softly. The words weren't cruel, but they cut deeper than mockery. Heat flamed in her cheeks. She nodded quickly, retreating, every step away from him feeling like a stumble, even though her stride stayed straight. Passengers exchanged, knowing looks. They saw what she saw, that his acknowledgement wasn't just about the water, it was about control. He had given her the smallest piece of recognition, but on his terms. She fled back to the galley, clenching her fists until her nails bit into her palms. "You're losing them," she thought bitterly. "They're not looking at you anymore. They're looking at him." In the cabin, Marcus finally sipped the water, placing the glass back on the tray with careful precision. His calm radiated outward, seeping into the atmosphere, stabilizing everyone around him. Passengers leaned toward one another again. He doesn't even have to try. She's unraveling all on her own. I've never seen power like that. Quiet, dignified. Honestly, I think she's afraid of him now. And they were right. For the first time in her 12-year career, Miss Stevens realized she wasn't the authority in first class. The uniform, the rules, the badge, all of it had slipped away. The turbulence had ended outside, but inside her chest, the storm raged louder than ever. And as she looked down the aisle, watching Marcus Hale calmly turn a page in his notebook, she knew one thing for certain. This flight wasn't hers anymore. It was his. The cabin lights dimmed to a soft glow, mimicking twilight even though the world outside was still drenched in daylight above the clouds. In first class, conversations softened, voices lowered to hushed tones. But the undercurrent remained. All eyes kept drifting back to Marcus Hale. He hadn't asked for attention, hadn't raised his voice once, yet the respect around him was thick, undeniable. It clung to the air like gravity. A passenger, 2 rows. Back leaned forward again. "Mr. Hale, forgive me, but what do you believe is the future of flying beyond just profit, I mean?" Marcus set his notebook aside, folding his hands in front of him. His gaze was steady, thoughtful. "Flight," he said softly, "isn't just travel. It's perspective. From above, borders vanish. The divisions we cling to shrink until they're nothing. If airlines remembered that, they'd serve more than passengers. They'd serve humanity." The words landed like stone in still water, rippling through the cabin. Passengers exchanged looks, some even nodding. A woman whispered, "That's beautiful." Marcus leaned back again, saying no more. He didn't need to. His silence was a punctuation mark, making every word echo louder. At the edge of the galley, Mrs. Stevens clutched a service cloth, listening. Each line twisted deeper into her chest. His voice, calm and dignified, only magnified her earlier cruelty. The memory replayed. "We don't let people like you sit up here." Her own words now felt monstrous, unfit for the polished cabin she'd sworn to maintain. And then came the symbolic crack she hadn't expected. A small boy, no older than 7, peeked shyly over the top of seat 2B. His curls bounced as he craned his neck, staring wide-eyed at Marcus. Marcus noticed. Slowly, with a faint smile, he leaned forward. "Evening, young man," he said softly. The boy blinked. Are you the boss of the plane?" Laughter rippled gently across the cabin. Marcus smiled, his eyes glinting. "No," he said. "The captain flies it, but we all share the sky." The boy grinned, his shyness melting. "How sound important?" Marcus tilted his head. "Everyone's important, even you." The boy's mother pulled him gently back into his seat, apologizing quickly. But Marcus lifted a hand lightly. "Let him dream," he said. "That's how flight began." The passengers smiled, nodding, their admiration deepening. A few even clapped softly, as though he'd given a speech meant for more than just first class. Ms. Stevens watched from the shadows of the galley, her chest constricting. The contrast was unbearable. He lifted a child with dignity, and she had tried to drag him down with contempt. Her hands trembled as she rearranged silver cutlery that didn't need rearranging. The passengers weren't looking at her anymore. The role of caretaker, of authority, of comfort, it was gone. He had taken it without trying. No, not taken, earned, and the cabin knew it. A passenger whispered just loud enough for her to hear, "That man carries himself like a leader. The airline's lucky to have him." Her pulse stumbled. The airline's lucky to have him. She wanted to shout that they didn't know him, that he was just another passenger. But deep down she knew the truth. They did know. Maybe not his name, maybe not his entire portfolio, but they knew what mattered. His presence, his dignity, his authority. She tried to compose herself, straightening her jacket, smoothing her hair. But her reflection in the galley mirror betrayed her. The uniform no longer looked crisp. It looked heavy, ill-fitting, as if it belonged to someone else. Marcus returned to his notebook, but the passengers kept stealing glances, their respect now unspoken but unmistakable. Even those who hadn't spoken to him carried themselves differently, sitting straighter, as if his composure was contagious. For Miss Stevens, though, it was suffocating. She leaned back against the counter, closing her eyes. Her mind raced with panic. If he really is who they think he is, if he speaks to someone at corporate, the thought clawed at her chest, sharp and cold. Back in the cabin, the boy's voice carried again. "Mister, can I be like you when I grow up?" Marcus looked at him with warmth that filled the entire row. "Better," he said simply, "be better." The boy beamed, and passengers smiled, their admiration now complete. Miss Stevens turned away, biting the inside of her cheek so hard she nearly tasted blood. She could no longer deny it. Her authority had evaporated. In its place stood a man, she had mocked, now shaping the cabin without effort. And she felt smaller with every breath. The hum of the engines became the soundtrack to the silence that now hung in first class. It wasn't an empty silence, it was charged, alive, filled with unspoken thoughts. Every time Marcus shifted in his seat, heads turned, eyes followed, breaths held. Miss Stevens lingered near the galley door, her tray trembling ever so slightly in her grip. She forced herself forward, posture stiff, face tight. She had served these aisles for years, had kept her composure through turbulence, crying children, even near emergencies. But never had she felt so powerless, so invisible in her own domain. "Mr. Hale?" one passenger finally said, voice cutting gently through the silence. If you don't mind me asking, do you often fly this airline?" Marcus lifted his eyes, steady and calm. "I do," he replied simply. "Quite often." The words were innocuous, but the tone, it carried weight. It was the sound of someone accustomed to movement, accustomed to being at the center of decisions, larger than any flight attendant's authority. Miss Stevens felt the passengers leaning toward him again, hungry for his words. She straightened her shoulders and walked down the aisle, forcing a smile. "Would anyone care for dessert? We have a lovely crème brûlée tonight, or a light fruit tart." But no one answered. They were watching Marcus. It was as though her words dissolved before they reached their ears. For years her voice had commanded attention, sweet but firm, professional but absolute. Now it was little more than background noise. Her jaw tightened. She placed a tart delicately in front of a passenger anyway, but even the thank you was distracted, their eyes drifting back to Marcus before the fork even touched the plate. Marcus didn't gloat. He didn't even smile. He simply existed. His presence eclipsing hers without effort. And then the symbolic moment came. A woman in 1C, elderly and dignified in her pearl earrings, slipped her pen as she tried to sign a customs card. It clattered onto the carpet. Before Miss Stevens could step forward, Marcus bent gracefully, retrieving it. He handed it back with both hands, his eyes warm and respectful. The woman's gratitude was immediate. "Thank you, sir. You're a gentleman." She said it loud enough for the whole cabin to hear. A gentleman. The word sliced clean through the air, through Miss Stevens's carefully built facade. She had mocked him as someone unworthy of first class, had spoken to him as though he were beneath her. Yet now in the passenger's eyes he wasn't just her equal, he was her better. The old woman looked at him again. "You remind me of my late husband. He carried himself with grace no matter what room he entered." Marcus inclined his head. "That is a rare compliment. Thank you." The passengers smiled, whispering softly among themselves. The respect for him was no longer quiet. It was declared. Miss Stevens swallowed hard, her throat dry. She returned to the galley, her palms damp against the tray. Every word from the passengers was a dagger, every glance at Marcus a reminder of her failure. Inside her mind, panic brewed. If he really is connected to the airline, if he tells someone what I said. But another thought crept in, quieter, more poisonous. What if he doesn't need to? What if they already know who he is? Her hands shook as she poured coffee she didn't need to pour. The pot clinked against the cup, spilling a few drops onto the saucer. She cursed under her breath, wiping quickly, hoping no one had seen, but one had, Marcus. His eyes lingered on her briefly. Not cruel, not triumphant, just observant, and that was worse. It was as though he saw straight through her, beyond her uniform down to the fear that had begun to rot inside her chest. She spun away, unable to bear it. The rest of the cabin watched him with quiet awe. He didn't have to prove himself. He didn't have to raise his voice or flash credentials or drop hints. His silence was heavier than words, his calmness more commanding than authority. Miss Stevens, once the unchallenged guardian of first class, now felt like a stranger in her. own kingdom. The weight of silence pressed down on her, reminding her of the line she could never take back, "We don't let people like you sit up here." And though Marcus said nothing, though he simply returned to his notebook, she felt the unspoken truth, tightening around her like a noose. Her power was gone and it would never return. The silence in the cabin wasn't empty, it was judgment. The night sky outside had turned velvet black, sprinkled with stars. Inside the cabin, the dim glow of reading lamps gave the air a hushed, almost reverent atmosphere. But beneath that calm, tension pulsed. Ms. Stevens strode down the aisle, her smile painted on, too sharp at the edges. "Would anyone care for a refill, coffee, tea, perhaps something stronger?" The passengers barely looked at her. Their voices had grown quieter, clustered instead around Marcus Hale. Every attempt she made to reclaim attention only deepened her invisibility. She set a glass of water on a tray table too quickly. It sloshed, spilling onto the passenger's cuff. "Oh," she gasped. "I'm terribly sorry." The passenger waved it off, distracted, turning his head toward Marcus. "Sir, you were saying about new technologies, how they change the passenger's sense of safety." Mrs. Stevens froze, cloth in hand, as Marcus leaned forward. His voice was even, patient, carrying just enough weight to hush the air around him. "Technology matters," he said, "but it's people who define the experience. Trust isn't built in steel or wires. It's built in how you treat those who walk aboard." It was subtle, almost too subtle, but the words fell like hammer blows against Miss Stevens's chest. "How you treat those who walk aboard." The passenger nodded deeply, muttering, "Remarkable." Miss Stevens swallowed, her throat tight. Her heart beat faster as she caught the sideways glances, passengers looking at her, eyes narrowing ever so slightly. She knew what they were thinking, and then it happened. A woman in 2D who had been quiet for most of the flight leaned toward her neighbor. Not loud enough for everyone to hear, but just enough. "Did you hear what she said to him earlier?" The neighbor raised his brows. "What do you mean?" "She told him people like him don't belong up here." The words, though whispered, carried like wildfire. Miss Stevens felt the shift in the air, subtle, chilling. Heads turned, whispers traded. Her skin prickled, as though the entire cabin had turned its eyes on her at once. That can't be true. She said that? To him? The murmurs grew, threads weaving into a net that tightened around her. "No," she snapped, too quickly, too loudly. "That's not what happened." Her own voice betrayed her, cracked, defensive. The passengers stared, their doubt thick and unblinking. Marcus, however, said nothing. He merely returned to his notebook, turning a page with calm deliberation. His silence made the air heavier, louder than any protest could. "Miss," one passenger finally said, voice edged with disapproval, "I don't think that tone is appropriate." The words landed like a slap. Miss Stevens's hand shook around the tray she carried. She forced another smile, brittle and false. "I assure you I would never—" But the passengers' eyes told her they didn't believe her. For the first time in her career, the weight of judgment wasn't in her favor. She wasn't the guardian of standards anymore. She was the transgressor, the one out of place. She retreated into the galley, chest heaving, pressing her palms against the counter. Her reflection in the mirror showed sweat beading at her temples, her lipstick fading. She didn't look like authority anymore. She looked like fear. And all the while Marcus sat in his seat, dignified, unmoved. He didn't need to speak. The passengers were doing the work for him. Back in the cabin, a passenger whispered, "Imagine insulting a man like that, and listen to how he carries himself." Another voice, "He deserves better. People like her shouldn't be in first class service." The irony burned like fire through Miss Stevens's veins. The very words she had flung at him were now circling back, aimed at her. The cracks in her ceiling, the one she had guarded so ruthlessly, were splitting wide open, and Marcus hadn't even revealed who he was. Not yet. The plane hummed steadily through the night sky, but inside first class the air had shifted, tense, electric, waiting for a truth no one could quite name yet. Marcus closed his notebook, placing it gently on the tray table. He folded his hands, posture calm, expression unreadable. The silence he carried seemed to pull everyone in closer, like gravity. Finally, the passenger in 2A leaned forward, unable to resist any longer. "Forgive me if I'm prying," he said carefully, "but you speak with such certainty about this industry. Are you involved with an airline?" The question hung in the air, fragile but heavy. Miss Stevens froze in the galley, her hand gripping the counter so tightly her knuckles went white. She prayed he would laugh it off, pretend, deflect, anything. Marcus lifted his gaze, his voice, low but firm. "Involved, yes." A ripple moved through the cabin. Another passenger chimed in, emboldened. "Are you an executive?" Marcus's eyes lingered on the man for a moment, then drifted back toward the window. His reflection in the glass was steady, dignified. "I oversee investments," he said evenly. "Several airlines rely on my funding to operate, including this one." Gasps broke the hush. The words landed like thunder in a small room. Funding. This one. Mrs. Stevens felt her knees weaken. She braced herself against the galley wall, her heart hammering so loudly she thought the passengers might hear. "He funds the airline?" a passenger whispered, incredulous. "This airline?" Marcus inclined his head slightly, not as boast, but as confirmation. "Yes." The whispers turned into stunned murmurs, admiration rising like a tide. A man she had dismissed as unworthy of first class was, in truth, one of the very pillars holding the airline aloft, and she had told him he didn't belong. Her blood ran cold. The passenger in 1C, the elderly woman with pearls, leaned forward. "Mr. Hale, you must forgive me. We had no idea we were in the presence of someone of your stature." Marcus gave her a faint, almost sad smile. "Stature isn't what matters. How we treat one another does." Every word twisted deeper into Miss Stevens's gut. The murmurs grew louder. "Remarkable. No wonder. Did you hear that? He funds the airline." And then the inevitable shift came. All eyes swung toward the galley where Miss Stevens stood, frozen, pale as the uniform she wore. It was silent again. Silent, but crushing. The passengers didn't need to speak. Their stares alone stripped her bare. Marcus turned his head slightly, his eyes finding hers. For a heartbeat she felt pinned to the wall, unable to breathe. He didn't speak. He didn't need to. His presence was the verdict. She swallowed hard, forcing her lips into a trembling smile. "Mr. Hale, I didn't realize—" But the words broke apart in her mouth. They were flimsy, useless against the weight of what she had done. The passengers' judgment pressed harder, thicker, filling the cabin like smoke. She could almost hear their unspoken words. "You told him he didn't belong. And yet without him, this plane, this seat, this job of yours wouldn't even exist." She stumbled back into the galley, chest heaving. The walls felt smaller, closing in on her. For the first time in her career, she wanted to disappear. Marcus, meanwhile, leaned back in his seat, calm as ever. His silence wasn't passive. It was deliberate, commanding. He wasn't here to punish her, not directly, but the truth itself was punishment enough. Passengers whispered again, this time with reverence. Imagine being insulted by her, and handling it with such grace. He didn't even raise his voice. That's what real power looks like. Miss Stevens closed her eyes, but the words cut through anyway. each one a dagger reminding her of her collapse. The unmasking was complete, and the night wasn't over yet. The cabin lights brightened as the flight attendants prepared for descent, but for Miss Stevens, no light could cut through the shadow pressing on her chest. Every glance from the passengers felt like a spotlight, harsh and unrelenting. She had once commanded this space like a queen. Now she was an imposter on her own stage. Marcus Hale sat calmly in his seat, penning one final line in his notebook. His posture was effortless, his face unreadable, as though the weight of her words hadn't cut him at all. And maybe they hadn't, not because they weren't cruel, but because cruelty had no power over him. The elderly woman in pearls turned, her voice steady. "Mr. Hale, I want to thank you. Not for what you've done for this airline, but for the way you've carried yourself tonight." Several passengers murmured in agreement. "Hear, hear." Truly remarkable. The applause that followed wasn't loud, but it was warm, genuine, undeniable. Ms. Stevens's throat burned. Applause. For him, in the cabin she had sworn to control. She wanted to shout, to defend herself, to say she hadn't known who he was. But she knew the truth. It wouldn't matter, because dignity wasn't about knowing, it was about choosing, and she had chosen cruelty. The captain's voice came over the intercom, announcing their descent into New York. The city glittered below, rivers of light threading through the darkness. The passengers leaned toward their windows, marveling, but Marcus remained still, his eyes fixed ahead. Finally he spoke. Not to her, not even to the passengers, just aloud, his voice calm and steady. "Airlines don't exist because of engines or runways," he said softly. "They exist because people trust them. And trust is fragile. It can be broken with a single word." The words echoed through the cabin. Passengers nodded, some murmuring agreement, others glancing sharply toward Miss Stevens. Her face burned crimson. Every syllable was a mirror held to her actions. Marcus closed his notebook and slipped it into his briefcase. He didn't need to say more. His final words had landed, heavy and permanent, the way only truth can. As the wheels touched down and the plane taxied toward the gate, Miss Stevens gripped the jump seat, her nails biting into the fabric. She had never dreaded a landing before, but tonight she knew what waited. Passengers with complaints, supervisors with questions, an airline that could no longer afford silence. When the seatbelt sign chimed off, passengers rose, gathering their belongings. But instead of rushing for the exit, many paused, turning toward Marcus. Some shook his hand. Others simply nodded, their respect unspoken, but clear. "Safe travels, Mr. Hale. Thank you for your words. You've changed how I see this flight." Marcus accepted each with a quiet smile, his dignity unbroken. Then came the final blow. A passenger, the one who had overheard her earlier insult, approached. The front where Miss Stevens stood stiff, pale and trembling. He faced her squarely, his voice firm. "You owe that man an apology. Not because of who he is, but because of who you should have been." The words silenced the aisle. Miss Stevens opened her mouth, but no sound came. She turned to Marcus, desperation flickering in her eyes. "Mr. Hale, But he raised a hand gently, stopping her. His tone was steady, resolute. "An apology isn't for me, it's for every person you'll meet after me. Remember that." Her lips quivered. No words came. Marcus collected his briefcase, straightened his jacket, and walked down the aisle. Passengers stepped aside, giving him space, some even bowing their heads slightly as though in silent respect. He didn't look back. He didn't need to. Miss Stevens remained rooted to her jump seat, trembling. The applause still echoed in her ears, but it wasn't for her. It never would be again. As Marcus disappeared into the jet bridge, the truth settled like stone in her. chest. Her reign in first class had ended, and it had ended not with turbulence or chaos, but with quiet dignity, dignity that belonged to the man she had tried to deny. Above the city, another plane cut through the sky, lights blinking in the sea. Darkness. The sky belonged to everyone, and nothing she could say would ever change that.